Welcome. Good evening. This is Lynn LaCour-Delaire at the Red Deer Museum and Art Gallery, and I'm happy to host everybody this evening for our virtual talk with Ken Housego, all the way from Nova Scotia. So tonight we have Ken, and I'll give you an introduction in a minute, giving a talk on a place of belonging. This is all part of our public programming with the Prairie Vernacular exhibit that is now on at the Red Deer Museum and Art Gallery. The exhibit is on until August 15th, so if you haven't had a chance to come in and see the exhibit, we highly encourage you to do so. It's a fantastic exhibit on folk art from artists all across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. We have over 100 artists in this exhibit, and they come from all genres, and they represent both contemporary, historical, folk artists who are either trained or self-taught artists. I'd like to begin with some land acknowledgements. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of Treaty 6, the gathering place of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux, located north of the Red Deer River. We also live on the traditional territorial grounds of Treaty 7, the gathering place of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Nakota and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and all people who make their homes in the region south of the Red Deer River. So we do have one more virtual talk coming up, a mini tour on Saturday, August 7th at 2 p.m. with Pat Matheson, one of our art curators here at the museum. It's the last of our 6 mini tours that we have been running through the exhibition run. And the topic of this exhibit is memory, memoria, and the everyday. The Prairie Vernacular has many sub-themes in the folk art, and we focused on a few of these. If you've missed these mini tours, they are on our live YouTube station, so you can always check them out there. After Prairie Vernacular comes down, we have another exciting exhibit called World War Women, and it's a traveling exhibit from the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and that's going to be running from September 4th to November 21st. We do have an exciting virtual talk with Bev Tosh, who will be speaking on war brides on Saturday, October 16th at 2 p.m. So we will continue the virtual talks even though we are still open to the public. I would like to give you a warm welcome to Ken Housego. He is in Nova Scotia. He is now retired. He will talk much about his past, his place of belonging, which has started out in a place called Lions Head, Ontario, his grandparents' cottage, where he spent many childhood memories. He has studied painting at Humber College and received a BFA in 1974 at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, also known as NSCAD. In 1980, he received a Master of Fine Arts from York University and a Bachelor of Education from the University of Toronto. So Ken Housego is one very well-trained artist. He does not necessarily fit the vernacular, the prairie folk vernacular that this exhibit is about. He's very well-trained, but his work is very much in the style and the genre of folk art, and you will see some of his works coming up in his slideshow presentation. He has also taught at the visual arts program at the Grand Prairie Regional College for over 30 years, and he is happily retired and will be soon making art again in Nova Scotia. He's a multimedia artist. His career has included painting, sculpture, woodworking, collage, mixed media, and much more. Place, dreams, and circumstance are the important themes in his work. So at a very early artistic age, he decided to use his own environment and experience as a source for his visual explorations, as opposed to the conventions of mainstream art. And he'll speak about this too. He says, "I was enthusiastic and there was no need to match the norms of art school." So tonight's talk is named A Place of Belonging, and he will take you through his journey of artistic process from where it all began. So I'm going to turn it over to Ken Housego.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm on the air now.
Yes, you are.
Okay, super. Well, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I'm retired from the job, but not the art. So the presentation will be about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions and answers. The first screen you see here is an image from the Art Gallery of Grand Prairie in 1985. You might be wondering, why am I starting with, I'm going to just set my stopwatch here. Excuse me for a second. Okay, it's going. You might be wondering why I'm starting from such an old picture. Well, 30 years after this exhibition, I had an anniversary show in the same gallery, same day, same place. 30 years later, and some of the same people from that first show were also in that latter show. The show was called Keep the Home Fires Burning, and you can see the theme is sort of about fishing. It's been very relevant to one of my themes that I which I enjoy. This is what I look like now. You can probably just see, you may not even see me. I'm not quite sure if you can see me at all. Anyways, this is what I look like now. For the exhibition, I definitely grew a beard. Just for the promo of the show, wore my fishing gear. My sou'wester, which I sold later in a yard sale. I still have the raincoat, and I draw your attention to it because it creeps into a piece of art 39 years later. So the show was called Keep the Home's Fire Burning, and this is my only performance piece, and I'll talk about what that is later in a comical way. So you have to be very careful. Sometimes your education will resurface at the oddest of times. Okay, so the Prairie Vernacular show, just if you can't read the subtext on the catalog there, folk and contemporary art narratives of life on the Canadian prairies. So my art has been tremendously influenced by folk art, and in a sense, I am a folk artist, but I went to art school, so I don't really qualify. But in my heart, I really do look at the folk nature, the personal nature of how one expresses themselves, as opposed to using specific trends or ideologies of modern art. Okay, so this is one of the pieces in the show. If you haven't seen the show, it's called Harvester, and it's a little bit like a boat. It's a little bit like a greenhouse, maybe a barn. It rocks back and forth. It has a sail on it, and there's glass in the top here. It might be a little bit like a greenhouse as well. In the exhibition, there's a number of small wooden colored pieces around the outside. They might be inside the hull of the vessel here, and they're made out of old bits of toys and game pieces. As you can see, it's made with small nails and small pieces of wood. This is called plank-on-plank construction, somewhat like model building from scratch. The other piece that's in the show is called Homestead, Good Fare, Alberta, and this is actually based upon a story of a friend who decided to start homesteading. They knew nothing about cows. They bought a cow, and they were surprised. They had to learn what to do with a cow. Anyways, this is in honor of their struggles. The saw here is a little bit like a toy saw. It is modeled after my son's toy saw, and you can see the tooth here is missing and it popped out. It got bumped. I had to debate whether or not to fix it or leave it. I decided to leave it because things always happen in art, just like they happen in homesteading. Nothing ever goes true as an arrow. So, so there's trials and tribulations. So I left it unrepaired. This cow also will pop up later. It was from an earlier piece. I'll talk about that a little later. So a few examples of my newer works. This is a piece called Big Sky Feels Like Home, and it's about the dawn approaching and the stars are starting to fade away. So it's a very, very large piece. It's about 7 feet long, 3 feet high, and weighs about 150 pounds. And you can see there's cast iron handles on it that actually help to carry it. So I'm really known as a mixed media artist. I love mixed media, different. I've never had, for the last 45 years, I haven't done any piece of art in one single media. There's always been collage and mixed media. So there's branding in here. There's little game toy pieces. There's a piece of patinaed metal, a horseshoe, a gear off of an old thrasher, and this wonderful hand-forged sickle here, and a very, very personalized handle that the farmer made for it. Another little game piece here, some branding, some acrylic paint, and it's all finished with a type of oil finish. This piece is called Seeker, and I draw your attention to the base here, and I'm going to talk a little later about gingerbread trim, so you can see there's definitely a relationship here. So this is a little bit like a fishing lure. It's also could be, they used to make decoys for ice fishing. There is a hole here about here where the balance point is, and you could actually just hang it on a cord if you wish. It has a metal weight in the bottom, like a decoy would have, or it's also a sailing ship has to have a counterweight so it doesn't tip over. The base here is made with tropical hardwoods, and it's laminated up somewhat like a very, very fancy deck on a yacht. So you can see this is also mixed media. There's some copper here. There's an old rivet head here. Another rivet head here that's been cut off with a acetylene torch, so it's got a hole in it. Piece of rusty metal here, copper nails, and a little bit of splatter. Okay, so overall, there'll be inserted images along the way. I'll talk about place of belonging. It's almost like a feeling of home, pivotal moments, influences, what happens in the studio, what intrigues me, where I'm going now, new directions and steps. And at the end, there'll be questions, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you. So if you have a cultural heritage, you're very lucky if you have some sense of ancestry that you bring into your house, into your daily activities, your household activities, which help to identify you as being more than just Canadian. Nothing wrong with being Canadian, but we're all a very, very large melting pot. And so I'm a proud Canadian. There are a number of artists who just make art about being Canadian. However, my family has been in North America since 1750s. I am no longer Scottish, Irish, Scandinavian, or English. I'm none of those. I'm Canadian, but I have something that's very, very specific, and this is that place of belonging. I have a geographical identity, and this is just more than a hometown. This is the lighthouse in the little village of Lionshead that Lynn had mentioned. It's also a larger area. It's a peninsula called the Bruce Peninsula, and it's my place of belonging. It's how I identify and labeled myself very, very early on in my years. It's where my grandparents lived for many, many years. I spent many years there on the beach playing and exploring. I went to grade 12 there as well. So this is Lionshead. It's Ontario. And if you're unfamiliar with Ontario, there's Toronto, Lake Ontario, Georgian Bay, Lake Huron. That's the Bruce Peninsula. And it's about 150 miles long and 10 miles wide. Sometimes it's just referred to as the Bruce. So this is from a postcard of the village of 500. There is home, and there's the high school. My bedroom window was about 20 feet from the harbor here, and I could hear the water lapping up against the shore as I would fall asleep at night. So it was a wonderful place to grow up. We had free reign of the little village, unlike living in Hamilton, the city, where Mom would say, don't leave the city block, don't cross the road so I know where to find you. Here we just ran wild. We explored a lot, and it was a wonderful place to visit. This is what it looked like in the 1950s. There's home there. It's where my grandparents lived. I lived in 1967 for a full year. You can see a lot of these boats on the shore here. They are actually tour boats for lake trout fishing. There's a large lake trout industry, commercial industry, which has since vanished. And along with that, the sports fishing aspect of it also had vanished. This is myself with my grandparents in 1951. On the back of the photograph here, my mother wrote Kenny with his favorite toy, hammers and nails. I was building at 1.5 years old. Okay, so I am connected to the rocky shores, the blue waters, the mountains, the escarpment, the cliffs, the beaches, and the village. The whole place is my hometown. The whole Bruce Peninsula is my hometown, just not the village. So you get this sense that it has a very, very strong impact upon my view of the world. So I always built stuff in my grandfather's boathouse, and I would say probably this is where the artist in me started. And I did start by paint by numbers when I was 12 years old. By the time I was 16, I bought my first set of tube oil paints. I only took one semester of art in high school. It was dismal. It was not very engaging. And that was the last time I ever studied art before I went to art school. There's my first paint by number. Okay, on December 3rd, while living in Lionshead that year, less than 20 feet from the boathouse, I was sitting in the living room and I did a drawing. This drawing here, it's not a great drawing, but I was impressed at the time. I was 18 years old and decided I'm going to be an artist. So that was it. I never questioned that decision. I was turned down twice by the Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto. And my first time, I was really heartbroken because this is what I wanted to do. However, they could not evaluate my passion and dedication. That's their loss. It is their loss. I went to a small community college, Humber College in Toronto for 2 years, got a very, very solid fundamental background in art before I moved on to NASCAD, the art college there in Halifax. So influences early and ongoing, still ongoing, and that says gingerbread trim. So this was, I was discovering this in the village where the small town where my mother lived, Durham, Ontario. And this is a late Victorian house, and it's how people decorated and embellished their houses in the late 1800s up to the 1920s. There's a wonderful little backyard here. I'd love to sit out there with my morning coffee. So this is a little more elaborate and classical in terms of gingerbread trim. You can think of it as frosting on a cake. It's the embellishment, the adornment of the house. And this is actually in Ottawa. Okay, also I'm very intrigued by churches, especially the interiors. This is Notre Dame Cathedral in Montreal. I love all the architecture, the painting, the wood carving, the gold leaf work. It's really a bag of mixed media. So this is a piece I made while living in Montreal. You can definitely see it is related to that idea of gingerbread trim. It's decorative, it's fun, and it's all made with wood. So I've been in Nova Scotia now for about 2.5 years with my wife. We retired here 2018. Nova Scotia is not without its wonderful old architecture as well. This is in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. This is the Lunenburg Academy. This is the local elementary and high school. It was actually functional as a school up to 10 years ago. It's all constructed, other than the foundation, it's all constructed out of wood. It was designed by a shipwright, somebody who designed sailing ships. It looks a little bit like Hogwarts. It's just an unbelievable building. They use it for a daycare now and a library, and teach music classes in here. Okay, one artist in particular who has influenced me more than any other artist is Greg Corneau. And it's not for what he did, but what he thought. He had a very, very specific slant on looking at the world around him. And that was, he actually went to the Ontario College of Art, never graduated from there, left after his 3rd year, and returned back to the small city of London, Ontario, which probably would have been about 30,000 at the time. This is an example of one of his paintings. I love the color in it. I'm very attracted to color. He was an avid cyclist, and he was hit by a car, and he died at 56 years of age, which is a shame because he was just making international waves at the time. He was a mixed media artist. He also did a lot of journaling, and this is actually a painting that's done with rubber stamps that are about 3 or 4 inches tall. And this is a story of the view of Victoria Hospital, which was out his studio window. So I was inspired by Greg Corneau's use of collage, text, recording, and bright colors. But more importantly, he's making about his own hometown, his local history. This has been termed regionalism. In a sense, he gave me the license to explore Lionshead. I knew Lionshead was really important to me, and it's very dear to my heart and who I am. And that was the first step. Said, well, I'm going to just make art about things I like. So really explore your own backyard. So there's a number of other painters. I started off as a painting before I became involved in woodworking and sculpture. It's a good friend, Stuart Burgess, who was a fellow student a year ahead of me. He was influenced by Larry Rivers, a New York City artist, and you can see it's pictorial, but it's also expressionistic and maybe somewhat partially abstract. I like his work a lot as well. So Stuart was influenced by Larry Rivers, as was I. Another artist who influenced me for a spell was Harold Colunder, and not very often do you get to meet the artist who influenced you, but actually thank him for it. This is Harold hugging one of my sculptures in Grand Prairie, Alberta, the Queen Elizabeth II Hospital. Anyways, this is not an example of Harold's painting because I could not find one. That was going back to the early 70s. There's just nothing to be found. But this is what resulted from looking at his art. Splash painting. with directed splashes of color. Okay, and there's my friend Stuart, an early mentor and a good friend of 51 years. So I moved to Halifax in 1972 as a really rough and tumble seaport, kind of grisly, run down, not the prettiest of cities. Today it has changed dramatically. It's far more cosmopolitan. It attracts a large tourist base and tour ships. My first week there, I discovered figurehead carving. I knew about them, but I've never seen figurehead carving before. The public gardens had this bandstand, and it was just gingerbread trim overload. I was in my glory. What was interesting about me moving to Nova Scotia, I felt at home. Instantly, almost within a couple months, it felt like home. There was water, there were boats. It wasn't too large. It had a real quality to it, and it became my home away from home. As the Lion said, became my home away from home. Okay, so in the early 70s, Nova Scotia Art and Design was a cutting edge or avant-garde institution. They're pushing the boundaries of art. Painting was no longer painting as we understood it, or sculpture was no longer sculpture, something you put on a pedestal. I mentioned that I had 2 years of very, very solid understanding of art and design and painting and drawing. This is my one of my paintings my first year, and we didn't paint on little panels. This was 5 feet by 4 feet. And this was it was reworked 1 year later during the summer while I was at home. And you can see I've added a frame with gingerbread trim. There's a little bit of text in there, and it was which came off the back of the photograph. So courtesy to Greg Corneau giving me a license. So art school, once you have those fundamentals of design, composition, and drawing, art school is really not learning how about making art. It's really about being exposed to different ideas. So there's a smorgasbord of things happening when you go to art school. There's ideas everywhere and you're being bombarded. So it's an environment of exposure to new ideas. So these are some of the ideas that were floating around NASCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, in the early 70s. So I came from a very, very traditional background to this environment, like this exploratory environment. This is performance art. I'm not going to call these styles. You may want to think of them as temperaments. So the best way of thinking about this is a theatrical art form. So this is by Dennis Oppenheim's Tactics for What? Well, tactics for a second-degree sunburn. Isn't that a smart idea? Lie on the beach for 4 hours with a book and get sunburned. Is this art? I'm not going to debate it. However, performance art needs some form of documentation. Just like going to the theater seeing Cats or Phantom of the Opera, you might keep the brochure, the program. You might buy a book or the soundtrack as a momentum or as a memory or keepsake of that moment in time. Otherwise, it's fleeting and it's just your memory. So documentation is really an important part of performance art. So when I was hamming it up for that photo shoot within that raincoat and with the gaff hook and the bread, that was my only performance piece. And when I was hamming it up, I said, my God, I'm doing a performance piece. And I chuckled to myself. That's the last time. Well, I've hammed it up before, but it was a little insight. So another type of temperament is called minimal or conceptual art. So this is a piece of sculpture, and I have actually walked across this and got my wrist slapped by the security guard. It's 64 pieces of copper. Each piece is 2 feet by 2 feet, and it's about a ½ inch thick. This is an awful photograph. It is such a wonderful textural surface to encounter, and it's a large area. So anyway, so this is one of those temperaments of the time. Now, process art is also another one of those things which were out there. So it has nothing to do with the tactility of materials or paint or the lusciousness of a brushstroke. And it's an idea, and it's the processes involved. So this is Harold Lucas. This is called Lucas Every Day for a Year. This is January 1974. So when his son was very small, every day he took a picture of his son and put it on a board here, which reflected the layout of the calendar. Harold Pierce. Yeah, I met Harold Pierce, who just actually passed away about 1.5 years ago. I've gotten to know him a lot better since moving back here. I only took one course from him, but he became a good friend. Okay, New York City in the 70s was the art capital of North America, one of the major art capitals. I've been there twice as a student and once later in 1984. Of all the places, so NASCAD was a hodgepodge of ideas. Things were rolling around. Students often get lost in that environment. Who am I? Well, I discovered folk art in New York City on that first trip to New York City in 1973. This is the iconic piece for the show. It's a functional gate from the 1700s, made by some craftsperson in honor of the American independence. So here we have a typical folk artist, and folk art goes by other names. You can see folk artists are usually very, very happy people. He's decorated his house. And folk artists are artists who have no training per se. They just make stuff with the knowledge and the skills they have at hand. Sometimes the easiest way to think about it is people's art for the people. Other names might be naive art, vernacular art, like in the subject, the title of the show. It's a little more academic, brute art or outsider art. So here's an example of Nova Scotia folk art by Craig Nogler. This hangs in my dining room. It's crawling up the wall. It's a yellow polka dotted lobster. Lots of fun, lots of color. And what's interesting, you do not need to go to art school to appreciate and understand folk art. It is what it is. It's delightful, it's fun, it's engaging, often it's narrative. So what caught my attention in the 70s? The stone has been cast. So just to recap, gingerbread and folk art, what is the common denominator in my art? That place of belonging and regionalism by Greg Corneau. So working with wood is very procedural and slow. And there's also this other half of me which wants to be bad and naughty and be spontaneous. So I have three artists there who I admire greatly for their ability to paint and push the material around. They're expressive, spontaneous brushstrokes. So there's this balance between procedure and spontaneity. That's what I'm trying to seek out right now while I'm in Nova Scotia. And I just touched upon it before I left Alberta. So let's see where this took me. Let's see where NASCAD took me. So once you have the basics, often one is asked, what might the art be? Not how do you make it? You would never ask, how do I make something in art school? That's the last thing you'd ask. So I'm going to tell you a little story about this photo. This is it reminds me of got the clock bonging here. I might just wait a few seconds for it to finish. So we had a visitor from Scotland. His name was Richard DeMarco, and he's promoting the Edinburgh Festival of the Arts where students could apply and go to the Edinburgh Festival and make art. So he talked about the megaliths and the stone circles of Great Britain, but what he mentioned in particular, what I remember specifically was a small stone footpath across a little brook, and it had been there for hundreds of years and had been worn smooth, and it was hollowed out by generations of people passing over it. And I said, what in my life has been a constant? I knew Lion's Head was a constant. So the one in the original, the only known photograph of my grandfather's washstand. My grandfather had a washstand outside the boathouse and a big enamel pail, and you go down to the lake, you get a pail of cold water, and you wash up outside in the morning. 3 boys in a small cottage, this was the perfect place to send us. We washed up outside every day, and it became a tradition. So after that presentation, I made a washstand based on what I recalled from my grandparents' washstand. Was it art? It did not matter. But what was interesting is I felt connected. I even happened to have an enameled wash basin kicking around the studio. And look, a little bit due to Greg Corneau, I have an old grocery store sign, and the name of the piece is in here, Good Morning Washstand. So I felt instantly connected. This was such a momentous, riveting moment. All of a sudden, I felt connected to who I was and what I was expressing. So another one of those temperaments might be called installation art, and this is where you use the space of a room as opposed to just using the wall or putting a sculpture on a pedestal. You transverse the space, and the space becomes an active part of the space, or the architecture of the room becomes an active part of the art piece. So there's the washstand. And over here on the right-hand side, you can see the clothesline is attached to the outhouse. And beside the outhouse was my grandparents' garden. And across the room, there was another piece of signage, and that's where the line finished. So nobody told me about installation. It was a lot of art. You learn art by osmosis and being around and being exposed. It just happened. So as I progressed through my years at NASCAD, I was there for 2 years. And by the end of it, was I confused? I was trying many different things. I was exploring. You can see the painting sort of almost turned inside out. The back is facing forward and whatnot. But I draw your attention to this right here, the box on top of this on the frame. Well, lo and behold, there's the same box. The piece has been cut up, remodified, and I do this a lot in my art. And I realized this later. I've been cannibalizing my art even as a student and as a professional artist now. If it's kicking around the studio, it's not in a crate. It's grist for the mill and might get cut up and used in another piece. And there's that signage, just been remodified as well. So I knew art had to come from the heart. So this is the first piece I made in 1975. It's called Apothecary Mysticism. Well, I'm just going to go back. I'll talk about it. Sorry about that. I just want to bring up my stopwatch here. It's gone to sleep. Okay, we're at 26 minutes. So it's a candelabrum. It's about 6 feet tall, 4 feet across. And you can see there's references to gingerbread trim and folk art. And it actually worked extremely well. It lit up the whole kitchen. So I was carrying it down a street in Halifax, and an instructor by the name of Terry Johnson came up to me and bumped into me and said, "How did you make that thing and go to school here?" It was really a put down. He's like sticking me in the back with a knife. I just had to chuckle. I had no need to match the trends of art school, all those temperaments I was exposed to. I do not need to fit in. I need to find myself. However, his comments intrigued me. So how did I discover who I was after I got out of art school? There's a lot going on. So how did I do it? I did it with a simple like list. Yep, I just made a list, and this is who I am. I like gingerbread trim, working with wood, folk art, carving, bright colors, paint. I enjoyed wood turning, and there's a lot of wood turning in gingerbread trim, and this is what I made. Cheers. Glass of milk to the cow. Studio processes, some of them. So there's that painting which I cannibalized, and I don't know how many art students cannibalize work 2 or 3 weeks after they make it, but I was doing that. In 1979, in a journal, I wrote down toying and cannibalizing your own art. It took me 5 years later to actually formulate words to what I was actually doing. I did it naturally. And this is another piece here, and you notice this ear here. Well, there's a cannibalized piece of art, and there's the ear down there. I cut up another painting just to use the ear. I don't see this as being destructive. The destructive process is part of the creative process. And there's that large candelabrum piece. It became a storage issue, so I cut it in half. It was very easy to do. It wasn't a problem. Problem solved. I could move it around. Oh, lo and behold, there's the cow off the candelabrum piece 39 years later. It has better eyes, ball-bearing eyes, and epoxy putty. The eyes are much better, and I used the deer tip for the horns. So I improved it. And there's the piece Seeker. 41 years later, I recycled the base. So I spend a lot of time hauling stuff around to my wife's dismay. I got boxes of stuff in the studio and a shed full of stuff which I collect. So I've had three large commissions, one in wood, one in steel, which Harold Colunder was hugging, and another stained glass. So this was in 1975. And you can see this before I went to grad school. You can see there's references to folk art, gingerbread trim. And I was really more or less a woodworker at the time. I was really very fond of Fine Woodworking magazine. I had all the back issues. I gleaned through those. It took about 7 months to make the piece. And this is a studio shot here, which scattered all over the floor in bits and pieces. The large-scale commissions, I've come to the conclusion I do not like them. They're more like a factory job. My art tends to live in the house. It gets put into the living room or the dining room in an unfinished state. I live with it for a few months, sometimes years before it gets finished. So this small work here, I consider my crown jewel. It's only about 6 inches tall. That's it, the smallest piece of art I've ever made, and is equally as satisfying and as rewarding as that large commission. And actually, I probably made more money per hour when I sold this one. So small pieces of work, they allow you to turn ideas over very, very fast. And you can see the mixed media. There's this is actually a horseshoe nail, a specialized horseshoe nail, so the horses don't slip on ice. And there's a little bit of branding in here and pastel work. So this allows you to explore materials very, very quickly in a small way. So those middle years, I would call my master's degree. When I entered into my BFA program, I was really a woodworker, a mixed media fabricator who made art objects. I really wasn't a sculptor per se. Sculptors deal a lot more with the nature and associations of materials and their metaphors, which was something completely brand new to me, which I hadn't even encountered before. I was a woodworker. I learned to become a sculptor when I did my master's degree. So this was the first piece here I did, and you can see it's definitely, I love craftsmanship. I was learning how to work with sheet metal. Blue jay there, I carved. It's got glass eyes and it's painted up with oil paints, a laminated wood turning here. The snowdrift is carved out of basswood, and the shadows are inlaid with lead. 2 years later, not a piece of wood to be found. I'm dealing with the nature and tension of materials. This was new for me, and it was exciting, just as NASCAD was exciting. Our art is about change and growth. You just don't stay static, but you always tend to go back and pick up old threads. So this is my graduation show. It's called Gently Down the Stream. You walked up a set of steps onto a dock in a gallery. There's a smaller dock attached to that. Oh, and this is the first time I did any miniature plank-on-plank construction. There's a night ferry, a breakwater, and I started to explore rocks and bread. This became really, really important. So in a sense, some of these parts were really, really rawly crafted, and other parts were more refined and honed. This idea of raw materials played off of finely crafted objects played an important part for about 7 to 8 years. So this piece is called Severe Distress. This is about grain farming. This is just bread and wood. I like the textural shift between the two shapes. But this is the last piece I did. Here I considered, I finished my master's degree 9 years after I actually left the school. This piece was called Western Icon. The construction in the center was made for the Calgary Winter Olympics in an exhibition. This is another exhibition that grew out of that show, out of that piece about a year later. And it's about 30 feet across. It's got about 1,000 pounds of grain in there, 150 loaves of bread, some coal, bear fur, bones, cow bones. I made an escarpment with all these raw materials, and there's the Western Icon, the bison skull, which is carved out of wood with cast aluminum horns, and then the implements of colonization hanging from it: the Winchester, the briefcase, the railway tie, the grain bin. So, in a sense, I've finished my master's degree. Now what? Well, always an emerging artist. Where do I go? Well, that wasn't a hard question to answer because I'm always searching and exploring. We ended up in Hornby Island, and this was a real eye-opener. Hornby Island is one of the interior Gulf Islands. There's Victoria right there. Hornby Island is about 200 kilometers up Vancouver Island. You go to Denman Island, and there's Hornby Island right there. Hornby Island, summertime population is about 1,500. Wintertime population is 1,900. There are no franchises. You will not find McDonald's here. You will not find Pizza Hut here. You will find private businesses and ingenious people, and it's the end of the line, and recycling and repurposing as an art form and as a living form becomes an important part of the island temperament. So this is the community hall. I draw your attention to this doorway. This is a tree stump inverted upside down. It's about 10 feet tall. It's easily 6 feet thick. And the doorway is cut with a chainsaw right through the middle of the stump. So they recycle, everything gets recycled and repurposed. It was just an unbelievable experience. They have something that's called the Free Store, and it looks more like a dump here. This is 1989. It's what it looks like now. It's a cultural hub of the island. So if you don't have something you're using, you take it to the Free Store and you can pick it up. Clothing, books, magazines, kids, toys for the kids, old freezer, whatever. It's not like a dump anymore. It's part of the identity of the island. Recycling. I wrote this in my journal. Hornby Island is like a piece of sea glass, not sharp, not shiny, not new, not showy, not slick. It just fits. This idea of just fitting is so important to my idea of how art should be made. It just fits together. It needs to fit, and once it fits, you know it fits. So I made a piece off the beach, just out of flotsam and jetsam, stuff I found. It's only been shown in an art gallery once. The rest of the time, it hangs on the back of my house, and it's actually, I brought it with me to Nova Scotia, and it's hanging on our back deck. It was a lot of fun. It was very, very satisfying just to go to the beach and find materials and make this composition. So this is a studio shot in Grand Prairie. You can see there's lots of, I make a lot of sawdust. So I've always had a space that was sort of dysfunctional. I could never paint in it, at the same time I was doing woodworking. The space wasn't big enough. It wasn't separated. It was either a painting studio or a woodworking or a sculpture studio. So there's lots of, so some of the things I collect and look at. So often I make small trees or houses for my art. So make 1, make 30, because you're going to end up using them anyways. If the shape is more complicated, make 4. I made 4 leg bones here. I only needed 1, so I had 3 more, and I'd use them in a piece of art. It's called Single Bone Moon. And this is an acrylic drawing with acrylic medium with soft pastels. So I collect rings of any type. Wrought iron, hand forged, cast iron. I collect old farming tools, hand tools, potato masher down here, serving fork up here, meat cleaver here. Sickles. This is my first sickle piece. Bought the sickle in Valley View for $15. And I've discovered that when you put a sickle in a piece of art, it sells much easier than a pitchfork. People don't like pitchforks in their art. Sickles sell really well. So this is mixed medias with soft pastel, and this little axe here I found in a junk store. There you can see a different meat fork and another sickle. This is called Winter. There's a winter landscape up top here. A little bit of rough inlay work here with cherry wood, birch, walnut, a little bit of branding and oil paint. This is called, this is called buckbrush. So I included an axe handle on this, and it's a hill with a winter storm. So narration is really important to my art. It doesn't have to be a big, long story. It could be just a simple little idea. Sometimes it comes from finding a material that brings an idea to mind. Sometimes the idea becomes before the material object, and sometimes it actually comes from a dream. So this Baby Sister Under the Stars, another sickle piece, and a cowbell. And you can see there's a cherry wood here, a piece of ebony here, another piece of, I think this is oak. And there's an old rivet head, some branding, piece of mahogany here. So this is the 3 sisters under the stars, big, middle, and baby sister in a studio shot. And I was definitely thinking about the grain bins on the prairies because I see them as sisters. Okay. So if you shouldn't be making art, you should be resourcing. So right now I'm in the process of building my new studio. It came with 3 lights and 1 plug and no heat and no insulation. I'm getting there. So if you're not looking, you should be collecting and resourcing, building, collecting, looking around. Art should never be idle. So often I work from the idea of a toy box and cannibalizing older pieces of art. I have a box of odds and ends, which bring forth ideas. I'm always collecting stuff at yard sales, which might be incorporated into a piece of art. I found this roll of wire. I brought it with me. Couldn't get rusty wire like that easy. Real rivet heads from a Can 4 conveyor belts, which have been cut off. This is called stray spark. And there's a spark right there. And this bent piece of metal is from an old piece of wire that came out of a fire pit along the river outside Grand Prairie, where the bush people have their parties with beer. And you can see here, there's one of those rivet heads here. There's a flattened out nickel here, old tin can lid, lots of gooey paint. So, stray spark. So often somebody will bequeath me gifts of rusty nails, such as farmers after they burn down their sheds. I'm always collecting sheet metal, copper and sheet metal. This was my latest find this summer. What a treat. A big ball of polypropylene rope, that plastic stuff that all the sea life and the whales get caught in. This was just lying on the beach, washed, just knotted together. It was about 3 feet long, 30 inches high and 30 inches deep. It filled the whole trunk. Also collect materials such as oysters and clam shells and small rocks from beaches. I'm always looking for specific backboards, like things I could find and work off of. Some even chunks of wood that could be cut up and used as starting pieces. 2008, I went to Mexico for the first time and I discovered milagros. So a milagro is a religious symbol. Historically, they were made out of gold and silver. If you had an issue, you would take a milagro. They usually have little holes in them. It would get nailed to the back of the altar behind the church. So there's a lot of money behind some of those altars. And then you would say your prayer. This was definitely made. This is made by an artist in Mexico City. It's definitely made for the tourist trade. But I bought it. I liked it a lot, and I've since found milagros online and have bought them in my travels. But I didn't know. I've been dealing with milagros all my life. I just didn't know what they're called. So you can see that from another piece here, these little icons. Here's that houses, and so some of those game toy pieces I use, a little lighthouse. So these are all like milagros, little knick-knack toys that I use. This is a painting I saw in 2011. It's by an artist by the name of Aslam Kiefer. I've heard about him for many, many years, but this was the first piece that I saw. I did not like the painting. The painting was awful. It was awful. I chucked it out right away. However, I was intrigued by the texture. The texture of the painting, or the process of the painting, was more important than the object itself. It had tar paper in there. It had staples. It had bent pieces of metal. It had twigs. It had elastic bands. It's almost as if he swept up a studio floor and stuck it on his support there. Then it's been painted up as well. So it was a very, very verbose, courageous type of texture. About this, he works very, very large. And about the same time as I discovered that painting, I was looking at old power poles or telephone poles. This is in Toronto. Here's the Art Gallery of Ontario here on Dundas Street. Right over here, there's a nice little English pub called the Village Idiot. So you go see the art show, and you have a couple beer across the road. This is just outside that pub. This is a close-up. What a wonderful texture. Incredible. It took 30 years to make this. There's little bits of pieces of poster and paper in here, and the staples have all turned this dirty black color from pollution. This is another display board in Halifax. It's just starting. It's not on a telephone pole. It's on a large 3x3 display board area, but it's starting its journey as well. This texture and this process intrigues me. It's a little bit like Aslam Kiefer's painting. Things just accumulate. This is the accumulation of years of working and walking on wooden floors in an old general store in Hornby, Nova Scotia, which is the next town south of us. And this, I took yoga in this small space, and this was the floor I had my yoga classes on. And I said, how can I make this myself? It was really intrigued. So quite an intriguing texture. Age and time are an important factor. Eslem Kiefer often puts his paintings outside for a couple of years. So at one point I thought every artist needs a hobby, which might sound a little redundant, but I really think knowing who you are and your art better be enjoyable rather than academically inclined all the time. And right now I'm trying to figure out how to build a painting. I don't want to paint a painting. I want to build a painting. So drawing has been the gateway to this exploration. I've been doing figure drawing for about 10 years. And after I master figure drawing, I think I'll take up watercolor. In a sense, this is my hobby. It gives me a voice. It gives me another opportunity to explore in a creative way. This is a 20-minute drawing. We've tried making drawings go for an hour. They don't get any better. You try reworking them at home. It's a lost cause. We can't do it in 20 minutes. Just give up. Do a new drawing. So it's about problem solving with the materials. And there's an old drawing underneath here, which is just coming through. So drawing on top of a drawing. It's about process. It's about process, about history of the surface, like the telephone pole. So this is a direct result of seeing that Eslem Kiefer painting. It's called Pioneer. It was in 2015. And it's definitely, you can see it's sort of like the moon. There's a bucksaw down here. On the moon's surface, there's a small house and a tree, but there's all kinds of texture and it's broken color. So there's a tin can lid here. There's oyster shells down here, piece of rebar. There's a marine washer from a dock. There's one of those rivet heads here. All kinds of materials were just brought together, fastened down, and it's finished with a material a medium that's called cold wax, which is like a wax paste and oil paint. So I am a builder and a painter. In a sense, I want to build a painting and paint a sculpture. Sounds a little backwards. Okay, so this is another piece just using the scraps in my studio. So I didn't do a lot of cutting and fitting. I just found out where the scraps fitted in and made another moon piece. Another sickle, and the fish were a gift from a friend. And you can see some of the staple heads here are showing. No need to hide the process. And it's finished with acrylic paint and glazes to give the surface a little bit of depth. So upcoming directions, we're almost finished here. So I definitely want to go back and revisit old ideas. That early interest in the 70s I had with gingerbread trim hasn't been part of my art for a long, long time. But in a sense, I'm back home now. I'm in Nova Scotia. I'm going back. I'm picking up old threads and old ideas which interest me. I'm trying to weave it all together in with a broader understanding of what it's all about. So another piece, I had some gingerbread like material or like approach to it. This was from that commission in PEI. I definitely want to carve a few more spirals. I haven't carved a spiral since 1977, and I got an old Tibetan teak wheel. I'm going to cut it in half, and I'm going to put spiral sun rays across it. It's the first piece I'm going to make in my studio. So this is that small piece called Island. And there's a close-up of the surface, and it was very, very satisfying. So making pieces much smaller are really important. You get your ideas out faster. A very, very large piece from 2015, the same time as Pioneer. It's called Sailor's Greetings. And it comes, the anchor is the counterweight, so the arm doesn't droop. So the counterweight there holds the arm out level. And it's about 8 feet tall. And the story behind it is I encountered a sailor in a parking lot outside a convenience store, and we didn't spoke to one another, but he gave me the thumbs up. So sailor's greetings. I don't think he had a tattoo. It was a very, very hot, humid day. He had his dress whites on. He was not sweating a bullet, and his clothing was all sharply pressed and crisp and clean. I, on the other hand, was sitting in my car with a sweaty t-shirt. I was really amazed. This guy was cool as a cucumber. So often in larger pieces of art, you'll find small vignettes that could become other pieces of art. This is from the piece Sailor's Greeting. Definitely will be carving another thumbs up somewhere in my life. I'm interested in textures which are close to the surface. Mixed media, there's a lot of acrylic, some rust in here. As well as those more verbose textures with cold wax. I'm looking, subject-wise, I'm looking at the rocks along the beaches of the Atlantic shore. The Atlantic shore is really, really rugged and wild compared to the eastern side of the Bay of Fundy. Looking at marine architecture for ideas. I love the woodworking in here and the ironwork. Old rusting fishing ships. I want to make a ghost boat. So this is the icon piece in that show 30 years later from the first image I showed you, and it was called Beacon, and it was 30 years to the day in the same gallery. This lobster claw is 5 feet long, about 12 inches wide, and weighs about 150 pounds. I had to buy a chain hoist to move it around the studio. And the coloration is modeled after the markings of a typical lobster pot marker called buoys that would be attached to lobster pots that the maritime fishermen would use. So it's done with mixed media, just scrap pieces of wood glued together in the studio. And there's that raincoat. 39 years later, it became part of a piece of art, and it's in storage in my shed here. It'll get used in another piece of art. Deer antlers for the spikes on the lobster claw. A little bit of branding, some copper work down here. There it is in the studio. So I still want to make sculptures, but much smaller. So a piece that's been lingering for many, many years is a crab shell. I've been collecting crab shells. So the outside of this crab, I envision the sculptures being very crusted and red and crusty and lots of materials on it. But the inside the inside of the shell is always very, very smooth. And I want the inside of the shell to be more like a cedar strip boat. This nice, finely crafted woodworking on the inside. The outside will be rough and the inside will be finely crafted. So there's that opposite of material tensions. And last and behold, salt cod. And if you don't know what salt cod is, this is how cod used to be preserved. It was gutted, it was flattened out, it was salted and pressed. There's the fins left right on the fish. And this is the flesh side, and this is the skin side. It is hard as a rock. It is salty. You cannot eat it. You got to soak it for a day ahead of time. You can still buy it. It's hard to find, but it's still very popular in Portugal. I like the shape of it. I like the fact that it's hanging. It'd be an interesting piece of sculpture. Here's the fleshy side, which could be made with cold wax and old bits of metal and copper and rusty tin on the skin side. Nova Scotia has wonderful sunrises, lousy sunsets, wonderful sunrises. This is by a photograph by Betty Meredith. She's 83 years old. She's out every morning taking photographs. This is untouched. This has not been altered with Photoshop. This is actually the picture she witnessed. Parting thoughts. So whatever job you have, I worked in a cemetery for 2.5 years. It was quite the job. It wasn't anything to do with art, but whatever your job is, and it doesn't seem to fit, it too will pass. Survive it. Be very careful about wasting time, especially with computers. Here's my first Mac Classic experience. Oh boy, was I excited. Something I believe in very strongly is going to the studio every day for at least 5 minutes. Even if you're not making something, you go to the studio and you push materials around. In other words, you play with the materials. And 5 minutes turns into 10 minutes, turns into a half an hour. And especially if you have a job and you go to the studio every day for 5 minutes, by the end of the week, you probably got 5, 6, maybe 7 hours in the basement. And your art's moving forward. It's not static. Stopping and starting art is an amateur idea. So if you're not building, you should be resourcing. This is another way of keeping yourself going. So when you leave the studio, you should always know where you're going next session. So when you get to the studio, you say, I don't know what I'm going to do. You know what you're going to do. Doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. You do it, then you decide. You got something to react to. Okay. I usually can find something to appreciate in every piece of art that I can learn from. However, I do not have to like it. Eslem Kiefer is a good example. I enjoy looking at children's art. I enjoy looking at children's art, folk art, all kinds of art. I'm always gleaning for ideas, and Picasso said, creative people, artists steal, anyways, but amateurs just copy. something to that effect. You should always take time to rest and reflect. Have a whiskey in the sunshine. Art talk and art babble. This is a tower of books that's in my living room, and just to remind me that books were created by authors and critics. There is an art form out there that's called book art, created by artists in the book format. However, all these words are important, but they aren't the end all and be all. The art is the product of the artist. These are just there for reference, for possibilities of slight influence, but nothing to hang my hat on 100%. Treasure family and friends, they are precious. My mother was very fond of Lion's Head. This was a pilgrimage we had in 2014, a couple of years before she passed away. So my art, it contains the embers of a personal landscape that I'll leave behind for others to discover. So it's like stumbling upon an old fire pit. You take a stick and you go through the coals and you poke it. You're looking for something. You don't know what you'll find. You might find something. You may find nothing. It's also like going to the beach and just walking along the beach, looking for those little treasures. My art is the embers of a personal landscape that I'll leave behind for others to discover. And hopefully you have discovered something about how I think about my art, how I look upon the world, and how I respond to it. So I thank you very, very much for your time. Hopefully it has been enjoyable and you have lots of questions. I'm looking forward to a conversation. So, well, in the end, make art from the heart, from your passions and your values. This is the end. Thank you very much. I'm going to need some, I guess I click stop sharing screen now. There we go. I'm back, Lynn. Oh, I don't hear you.
Thank you, Ken. That was an amazing survey of your work and processes from past to present. I really enjoyed that talk. It was fantastic. I also still enjoy your artwork hanging on my walls as well.
Thank you.
So for those of you out there watching, you are welcome to enter the chat, type it in, and I will read the questions to Ken and he can answer them. And I have a few questions for you myself, Ken. First, and some of them are comments because you answered some of my questions.
Sure.
It seems to me that most artists, myself included, are collectors of things.
Yes.
Things are added to their artwork, or whether it's a texture, whether it's a piece of paper, whatever it is, or things inspire their work, or things of beauty that intrigue them, that they feel a connection with. So your work is definitely fits that genre, and very much like a folk artist. So one of my questions to you is, folk artists definitely are regional. They represent their area, and the artists in Prairie Vernacular right now are representing the prairies across Canada. Your work is very much inspired by a region, a sense of place of belonging, Lion's Head. Is this a reason why your work is considered folk art?
I don't think my work is considered folk art. However, we got feedback here. I don't think my work is folk art. It's folk art inspired. I'm also intrigued by the academia side of art, but it is not the leading edge of how I go about producing my art. Thank you very much for that. I take that as a wonderful compliment, though.
You're welcome. So the other question I had was, Lion's Head being your place of belonging, you're always sort of referring to boats and lighthouses and water and all those textures that you would see in that area. But you've also lived in the prairies for 30 years in Grand Prairie, Northern Alberta. Is there anything about Northern Alberta that made you feel like you belonged? What was it that you responded to there? Was it sort of farm-like? Was there any particular architecture or geography?
Um, I would say it's the rural aspect of the prairie, Calgary and Edmonton are wonderful cities to visit, but I would not want to live there. I've lived in large cities for many years, but I really enjoy the rural aspect. I enjoy driving back roads, looking at old buildings. It's that sense of history, that sense of somebody engaging with the land, engaging with the place, as opposed to living in a busy urban environment. We lived in Grand Prairie, and there's 10 minutes outside the city, and it was very rural, and we spent many hours driving and exploring the roads.
Good. Yeah, I definitely responded to the landscape as well.
Well, there I did make a number of prairie-related pieces, and actually, I've been just recently thinking about, we don't have northern lights here. I'm missing them. they're on Facebook every now and then. My God, I should make some work about the northern lights from memory, which is a very prairie experience.
Yeah, especially the northern prairies. That's an excellent idea. You mentioned quite a few times of being inspired by the gingerbread details on houses, and I know in the West that's something very common in the East, and it's not something common in the West. Is there any particular architecture that stands out to you? Like, I know you focus on a lot of grain elevators, barns, back to the rural thing. Is that what inspires you the most for architecture in the West?
I was intrigued with, I've did a number of pieces which were plank on plank construction with small pieces of wood and little nails, and they were architecturally informed by many of the older buildings in the prairies. I remember one place going down near the Shaftesbury Ferry, there's two houses across the road, and they're sort of leaning in towards it. I actually witnessed them collapsing into the ground over the 15-20 years. But that type of building, the plank on plank construction, like I didn't show any pieces. I apologize for that. Log homes. Yeah, log homes as well. Yeah.
Sounds very rural, definitely.
Yeah.
So it seems like you're much more interested in process than conceptual ideas in art.
Yes, I will.
And you did explore a lot of these ideas through art school, like you were talking about the avant-garde and the conceptual, and you sort of seem to reject them, although you did explore them. But I noticed a common thread, even when you were exploring all these different genres in art school, and it always seemed to be, what your like list, what responded to your heart.
Yeah, the like list is really important. I never lost the values of who I never lost sight of who I was, where I came from, and what I was engaged in, and what engaged me in the world. I have had friends who went to art school, and one particular fellow who went to OCA the year I didn't get in. I met him because I had a friend who did get in, and I bumped into him a couple of years later, and he said they all dropped out of school, and I said they pulled the wool over our eyes. I think actually what he was saying is they lost who they were as individuals in the process of going to art school. They lost their own personal values, and they dropped out of art school because it was meaningless to them, which is a shame. And I've always been very aware of who I am in that relationship. But I like a good art idea, and nothing wrong with that.
Well, and I think that's the constancy in your work, but that's also that sense of self that you know so well is what makes your work so authentic. And there seems to be that constant. You're always having your style might change a little bit, or you explore different things, but it seems to be surface and that surface quality seems to be one of those constants. I noticed you find beauty in the mundane, like from that power pole with the textures of the staples and the stained wood. You seem to have this keen observational skill for what's in your environment, and you seem to find the beauty in the mundane, and that's what sort of spurs your inspiration is surface.
I'm very intrigued. I'm very intrigued by texture and surface. Actually, I touch a lot of art when I go to art galleries. I'm not supposed to. You learn by touching. I've touched Picassos. Haven't touched a Rembrandt yet, but I've touched a few Picassos.
We say in the art world where the artists are the touchy-feely type, so I can relate to you 100%.
So tactility and craftsmanship are really very, very important. I like things that are well made, even though the painting has a sense of spontaneity to it. The Pioneer piece, the surface had a sense of spontaneity to it. It's really well painted. It's not going to fall off. Eslem Kiefer's pieces, I bet you pieces fall off.
I've seen some of his work live in London, England, and I too was very inspired by the texture, the tactile quality of it, and I think there was a lot of straw in it. So
yeah, it uses a lot of straw and organic material, which obviously does not suit longevity too well. So I'm sure the custodial staff sweeps up underneath his paintings every night.
Right.
I like his work a lot. I Google him a lot, and I'm very inspired by very, very large but very, very robust surfaces. I watched an interview by him not too long ago. He says sometimes he puts work outside for 2 years. I've actually did this myself, not knowing that he did it, and I watched the piece transform, and I said, darn, I let it go too long. It went over the edge.
Almost like it's overcooked.
And that piece that I made on Hornby Island, it's been sitting on the back of the house. It came from the beach. It was weathered by the beach, and now it's on the back of the house being weathered by Mother Nature. It's perfectly fine.
It's all part of the evolution of the process.
Yeah.
So now art, also mentioned art is about change and growth. What do you think was your greatest change in your art? Like what or when? Was it sort of the installation works that you were doing after your master's degree?
No, the biggest change is drawing. And actually, oddly enough, when I went to NASCAD, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in 1972, they didn't have any drawing courses because drawing was passé. Painting was passé. They never had a traditional painting course. They never had drawing. They maybe had drawing and foundation, but third year, fourth year drawing didn't exist. So I needed another year of solid foundation in drawing. I migrated towards working with wood because I'm handy with my hands, and that's how I express myself. When I was in Grand Prairie, I decided to go to drop-in figure. I've also continued that here in Mahone Bay in Nova Scotia. And it has been the most important thing I've done for my art in the last 20 years is take drawing. And it's sort of like a hobby. And I used to have my work had figurative elements in it before, and I hope to bring the figure back into it and tell stories through the figure, which I haven't done in many, many years. But that's a possibility as well. But drawing has changed my whole outlook and how I respond to surface, because drawing is spontaneous. It happens, and you got to. And woodworking is very slow and procedural. It's slow. It's so slow. And I got to find that balance between expression and procedure.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a good point, because drawing is really the foundation of everything in art, and without it, how do you get your ideas down so quickly? It is the fastest, most spontaneous way to get your thoughts on paper.
When I started off by doing a lot of small drawings. Before I did the large moon pieces, I did a lot of small drawings of moons. And I was thinking about NASCAD. They just talked about making marks, so I can make marks. No, I could not make a mark. I had to have something to hang it on. So the moon is a little piece of abstraction with its shapes, and I used the moon as a starting point. And so I drew the moon probably 50, 60 times in different media, and I got better and better all the time, and I got more and more spontaneous with it. And then I eventually started working with mixed media. And so drawing is the gateway that changed my art dramatically. And now I'm ready to respond to a more painterly surface with cold wax, which I couldn't have done if I had just been working with wood. I couldn't make that jump to that medium, because it's a different temperament. It's a different mindset. You got to respond instantly, just like in a drawing. Woodworking, it's like, how do I get this piece attached to this piece so it fits and doesn't come apart?
Right. That makes sense. And a lot of your paintings, I noticed you have drawn pastel in it, and even your really thick paintings are a really rich, lush combination of collage and wax and paint and all of that, and mark making. I love your quote where you say, "I build paintings and paint sculptures," because it is very much your multi-dimensional way of working and all these different layers, which is what makes it so intriguing and engaging. Is that you look and you look and you look, and it's sort of like this Where's Waldorf thing, where you every time you look, you find something new. And I think that's what holds and engages people to your work. So now that layering, it's sort of that, I like that, painting sculptures. Most people think of sculptures as just wood or metal or whatever, and not being something embellished. But I guess that's where the folk art comes in, is that embellishing the sculptures and painting them.
I would say that's where the folk art and the painting comes in. I started off as a painter before I was engaged in sculpture, and sculpture happened because lack of drawing at NASCA led me into working with wood, and it just became more three-dimensional. But yeah, lost my thought. Senior.
That's okay. That's okay. So now you talked about drawing being very foundational, and then when you went to, I guess it was your master's degree, and you were doing sculptures, and you were working with the materials, mostly stones and the raw materials. How did you find that process change your work?
It gave those highly crafted objects, I call them constructions, gave those highly crafted objects something to play off of. A rawness, a direct material content, as opposed to something that was fabricated and was manipulated a lot. So there's this balance, there's this contrast between that which is raw and direct, a loaf of bread, a lump of coal, an escarpment of coal and bread and grain, with this construction in there. So that contrast really intrigues me. Mm-hmm. I like contrast a lot in art, and how contrast can actually be used to manipulate the viewer and making him look around.
Mm-hmm. Well, those contrasts that you speak of, it sort of sounds a little bit like there's some formalism, sort of the very thing that you were sort of rejecting in art school, is that conceptual. Yeah, and so it's funny, and even the loaf of bread mixed in with the wood pile. There's your contrast once again.
As a joke, I used to tell my students, my job is to look for spaces between shapes. That's design.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I like design a lot. I like talking about design and color theory. I believe once the students have a good foundation in design, the world is their oyster. They have tools to use. I had some of those tools, and I taught those tools, retaught those tools to myself through teaching.
Good. Yeah, teaching is the best way to get to know.
Well, you have to know your stuff, or if you don't, you learn it as you go.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about drawing as a foundation, design as a foundation, and basically finding your place of belonging, finding that thing that's true to yourself and working from your heart. And that sounds like the three magic elements to making great art.
In place of belonging in terms of materials, in terms of environment. So studio environment is really important, as well as home environment, where you live, the location in which you live. So we're very happy here in Nova Scotia. In a sense, we feel very much at home. We connect to the people, we connect to the land, and we connect to the history here, even though I'm an honorary Nova Scotian.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ken. I look forward to seeing what your next pieces of art are and what direction you take in Nova Scotia. It sounds like you're looking at all sorts of wonderful surfaces again. So I look forward to seeing those in your work.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a delight to speak. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And for all the viewers, if you haven't seen this entire video, I will get you. It's recorded live. It's going to be available on Facebook and YouTube through our YouTube station, Red Deer Mag. So we hope to see you again at our next virtual talk on Saturday at 2 o'clock with Pat Matheson. He's going to be speaking on the Prairie Vernacular, on memory, memoria, and the everyday. So thank you again, Ken. So enjoy your time in Nova Scotia, and I hope to see you or hear from you or see your artwork again.
We'll make it back to the Prairies somewhere along the line.
Excellent.
One more road trip across Canada for sure.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks,
Thank you very
Ken.
much.
Good night. Good night,
Good
everyone.
night. Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.